This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by New Relic and Epsagon. This week, I chat with Joe Emison about optimizing for maintainability. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 73. Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Daly and this is Serverless Chats. Today I'm chatting with Joe Emison. Hey Joe, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So you are the co-founder and CTO of Branch Insurance. I'd love it if you could tell the audience a little bit about your background and what Branch Insurance does.
Absolutely. So I am a serial technical entrepreneur. Branch is my sixth adventure. And Branch is a home and auto insurance company, and we also sell renters and umbrella. And there are two things that make us completely unique in the United States. One of them is we sell the home and auto as a bundle much more easily than anybody else. So really anywhere else you would go to buy the home and auto bundle, you'd have to buy one and then the other, and it would take you somewhere between 45 minutes and 2 hours or maybe a week. And you'd get a lot of fake prices along the way. You'd get like well, we think it's about this. Okay, I need more information. Then it's about this. So we will sell you the home and auto together. And for most people, we just need your name and address to give you a real price that you can buy instantly.
Awesome. Well, so the thing I think that is probably the most interesting to the listeners is the fact that Branch Insurance is entirely serverless.
It is, and this is actually the third company I've started fully serverlessly. And Branch from the beginning has been built on Amazon's AppSync service. Uses Lambda, DynamoDB, CloudFront, and a bunch of other third-party services that we love.
Awesome. All right. So I have been watching your presentations. I've seen you at Serverless Conf. I've seen you at a couple of other conferences. And one of the things that I always thought was fascinating is how you're always recommending like some third-party service. Like you've got a third-party service for everything. Now, obviously, some of those are AWS services, but then you use other things like BigQuery and Stripe and these other ones, and then all these other different things. And I was trying to think of something clever. And we always talk about stuff like serverless first or static first or whatever. And I was thinking that your approach was very much so like third-party first. But then after talking to you about it, it's more about optimizing for maintainability than it is just using some third-party service. So what is that you do, especially at Branch, to optimize for maintainability?
Yeah, we think about optimizing for maintainability having two central categories. The first is the less you have to maintain, the easier it is to maintain. And so in that bucket goes things like code is a liability, so less code to maintain is easier to maintain, or running VMs and containers and having DevOps as a core competency that you need is if you don't need it, right? You run serverlessly or you need less of it, then that's also easier to maintain. And then there's another bucket, which is how do we not be blockers for all of the other departments in the company? And so we constantly ask this question of how do we empower other departments to go do what they need to do without talking to tech, without talking to product.
Right, right. And I love that idea of empowering other departments. And one of the things that I often see when I'm collecting links for my newsletter is people who write these posts that say they're using Google, for example, Google Sheets as as the backend database for something, and some people criticize it, but for the right application, it makes a lot of sense because then someone can actually go in, someone who doesn't have the ability to query a MySQL database or go into DynamoDB or something like that, can go in and just manipulate some cells in a database, and it gives them the ability to run some business process, which can be really, really effective.
Yeah, it is fantastic. And one of the companies I started, which I did as a sort of a weekend project for a friend, was an Angular app that sends a bunch of data to a Google Sheet for all these calculations. And since I built that in like 2015, 99% of the business logic of that application has been the main founder on that project making changes in Google Sheets. And
Right.
so he onboards a new customer, he sets up their logic in Google Sheets, and it does everything that they need to do.
Which is amazing, right? And then there's so many other applications that you can do that with, that make it very, very simple for. I mean, that's when you think of things like maybe Airtable, or even integrating things. I know in the past I've integrated into services like Asana, right, and just tie into the API so that
Yeah.
you already have those interfaces built, because that's one of the hardest things to do sometimes as a developer, is to build a really good admin. And if that's already built in for
Yep.
you, I mean, you're off to the races.
Yeah, and I think people too often will disregard using like a service like Zendesk, which is this kind of amazing Swiss Army knife. They'll disregard it because they'll say, well, it's I can envision a world in which we're going to want to do this thing, and it won't do that properly. But the problem is, you're a lot better off getting off the ground, getting things going, having a system that works, and then discovering what things really matter. Because I agree with you that probably you're going to run into cases where this third party service like SaaS tool with an API doesn't completely solve what you want. But the bigger problem is, what you think that is at the beginning is definitely
Right.
not going to be what it actually doesn't do later. And so, we live in a world where we don't have enough people who are constantly thinking, more than 50% of the things that we think we need to build in the way we're going to build them actually aren't going to work. We're going to build them, we're
Right.
going to put them out there, and like they're not going to be usable, they're not going to do what we need to do, we're wrong about these things. And so it's so much better to get it out, experience
Right.
it, even if you know that it's only 60-70% of like ideal, because that information that you'll get will enable you to make much better decisions. And often what you'll find is, when you weigh the priorities, you'll say like, well, Zendesk isn't perfect, but I'd much prefer to keep using Zendesk and use my development time on this other thing that I now realize is critical, for our success.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things too about, that I love about serverless, and just being able to kind of string some things together quickly to get a prototype up and running, because you do not know what is going to actually, never mind what's going to work, but what's going to be used. I can't tell you how many times I've implemented some process or some system that just doesn't get adopted by the organization because either the workflow is too complicated or whatever. But again, being able to test that quickly is a really powerful thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the problems when you are building new applications, right, and you're trying to, as you said, optimize for maintainability, one of the things you need to maintain or what you need to perform maintenance, I guess, is people, right? So you need to have engineers or software devs that can go back and they can look at that code, they can continue to upgrade it if they need to. So how do you make those choices? I know you have a software development guide at Branch, that you kind of put everybody through those paces. So what does that guide look like? You had mentioned, optimizing for maintainability, but what else? What else is part of that?
It's really it starts off completely on optimizing for maintainability and understanding that when you have multiple choices to make in the world, you choose the one that's going to be easier to maintain, and even if it like disagrees with whatever whoever luminary on Twitter says to do. I mean, recently we had a discussion about whether the right way to convert strings to numbers in JavaScript is, I guess the preferred way is a plus sign in front of the variable name, but you can just, use the number function, which is just much more readable. And so like that, we were like, I don't care if, so-and-so says you should use the
Right.
plus sign, like number, and then in parenthesis is a much easier way to read it. And then the rest of the document, the rest of the software development guide really talks about two things. One of them is, we practice Agile, and I think Agile in the way that I have heard Alistair Coburn, who's one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, thinks about it, which is, every week we come in peace to ship software, and every other week we do a retro to figure out how to do it better, and nothing else is sort of set. So you talk to a lot of people about Agile, and they'll say, "Oh, well, we're Agile. We do Scrum, and every 2 weeks we do a release, and we do a demo on this day, and this." And like, literally number one is people over processes. And like, if you just described your agile as a bunch of processes that aren't changing with ceremonies at the same time, like that's not agile. Like you have this is
Right.
process over people.
Right.
And so part of the software development guide after maintainability really goes into helping understand like what we're trying to figure out how to do this better. We don't know how to do it, or we have an idea on how to do it, but we're not saying we're perfect on it. And so we need everyone's input. And so we use retro as such a critical thing to do to figure out how to do all these things better. And then the rest that we talk about is in the guide is really about how what's most important for you as a developer is to seek how is to think about how you could be doing things better, how you could be shipping software better, what tools you could be using to be more effective. And we don't do enough of this, right? We actually hire people into jobs like Oracle DBA, which is just like if you ever wanted to get rid of Oracle, like you're probably gonna have to get rid of all the people who have the vendor's name in their title first,
Right.
right? But I mean, there's there we have this problem where people Ben Keogh talks about this, right? Where people identify with as experts in the tools they use, and that's really bad. I mean, you should identify in being able to ship software. It shouldn't
Right.
really, and you should identify as someone who can learn things. I mean, this is the most common debates I'm having over Twitter these days are really where, people want to say the right language is the language you know. And like, okay, but like what that says is you can't learn. And like the reality is if your job is figuring out how to ship software and you're like, I'm never gonna learn another language or another framework, like I'm only gonna use the stuff I know, like you're gonna be bad at it. I'm sorry. Like you might be good out of college, but like, oh my God, if you're still using the thing you learned in college and you're 35 or you're 40, like, you know, I mean, you're not doing the best thing. I mean, it's just true. And so the rest of what we talk about in this guide is like, it's important to learn and it's important to treat people very kindly and with respect. And so there's a lot of discussion actually about how to do a proper code review. Like this is how you review someone's code. This is how we make sure we have great code, but we we
Right.
don't make we don't make people feel bad.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
think that's I think that's something too where again as people grow as developers and they start using new things, it's very very easy, especially moving into serverless. There's a lot of information out there, but it's a whole different way to think about software development. So it's very easy for people to make mistakes or to do something wrong. And again, having a team that doesn't criticize but just helps you, you know what I mean, and helps you ship better software, I think is a hugely important piece of it.
Yeah. I think about it a bit as like how do you get to a world where everyone is relentlessly trying to do things better and is dissatisfied with like or is willing to be dissatisfied with what they just did. But how do you do that in a world where everyone respects everyone and treats everyone as humans who are great and wonderful people? And so and how do you separate those two things, right? And that's magic when you can do that.
Well, it's certainly not on Hacker News, I can tell you
No.
that.
No.
All right. So with your this idea of optimizing for maintainability, you mentioned this idea that code is a liability. The more things you write, the more code that has to go be maintained, the more that has to be upgraded later, maybe or whatever. And of course, you have potential issues with using third-party tools, right? Like they might change something, and maybe there's a breaking change or whatever, and you have to go back and change your code. But just in terms of that, sort of technical debt that builds up, how do you tell your developers to kind of think about technical debt as they're building something?
Yeah, we have no roadmap, essentially no deadlines, and unlimited refactoring.
Mm-hmm.
And so we tend not to do a lot of. We do have some like, hey, we should refactor this when we get back to it. But there's a lot. I mean, it is a very friendly environment in which, if you as a developer are going to work on something and you say, hey, I really think I need to spend a couple weeks refactoring something before I get into this, that's never we're never going to say no to that. Now, a lot of times there'll be a discussion about the best way to do that, and that doesn't happen with any sort of high frequency, but it's not infrequent that you'll get, okay, now that I'm going to tackle this thing, I'm going to go ahead and do this refactor, as part of it. And I think that's really it. Is again, this is maintainability, right? We say we optimize for maintainability. If we don't refactor things that we think need to be refactored, it's not going to be maintainable.
Right.
I was just going to touch briefly on you mentioned sort of like third party breaking changes. My experience is that doesn't happen with a high frequency.
Hmm.
I tend to find that the third party services, either APIs or SaaS that we use, tend to be way better at change management than we would be internally,
Right.
right?
That's very true.
I mean, it tends to be, I tend to think of all of them as like, what if I had a bunch of super expensive engineers who were like really good, documented things really well, had amazing
Right.
change management, amazing uptime, and I only paid them by use of the thing in a business context. Like, wouldn't that be great? Shouldn't I do that for everything? And
Right.
so I tend not to have. I mean, it happens from time to time, but I never like anybody who is telling me like, well, we would never use Algolia over Elasticsearch because we're worried about breaking changes. Like that person's just making that up. Like that's not a
Right.
problem.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think I would worry less about, breaking changes, but maybe new features that are added, things like that you're going to have to go and potentially do that. But no, I totally agree with you. I mean, that's one of the things that's nice about having a SaaS company is they are focused on that one specific problem, that business domain, and that's their job. Whereas when you have a team of developers, especially if you're a small team, just maybe four or five of you or something working on a project, you have to, if you're building all the stuff yourself, you are across a lot of different disciplines. So with the third parties though, so obviously if I said, okay, should I have, Algolia or should I use Elasticsearch? And should I build my own search there or should I just, use Algolia or Algolia? You say, okay, that is the easier choice because it is easier to maintain that. Obviously third party services are going to be easier to maintain. So what is the deciding factor? Because why wouldn't you just choose third party services for everything?
I mean, in general, I do choose third party services for everything. I mean, my general view is prove to me that this third party service won't work. Now, again, I have a very strong difference though between a third party service that's serverless and one that
Mm-hmm.
isn't. And so you can find third party services where they want you to go into like the AWS marketplace and run it on a VM. And that's not
Right.
serverless, and I'm not interested in that. Or like, oh, it's an open source project, run it yourself. And again, I'm not interested in that. And so, but when it's serverless, and my short definition of serverless is it's not my uptime. Like I literally can't influence uptime. I mean, beyond I could like put bad configuration or bad code in.
Right.
But like if some server fails, like it's not on me to bring it back up.
Right.
And so I think if you can have a serverless third party API, I think your default should be use that unless you can prove that you shouldn't use it.
Right. Right. All right. So then what about proof of maintainability, right? So we can say, oh, it's easier to maintain this code because I'm using some third party service, or it's easier to maintain because, again, it's in Algolia versus Elasticsearch. How do you actually prove that, though?
Um, well, so the easiest way to prove like maintainability of your code base, like does it have like terrible technical debt, or do you have terrible other issues with it, or bad, or some issues with it? I think is two things that you can do all the time, which is one, if every developer has his or her own Amazon account or whatever provider you're using account, and you can sort of check out the code and run a command and deploy it into a fresh environment. And it works just the same there. Like everyone has production. And you can onboard a new developer, ideally a junior developer, and they can start being productive as a member of the team very quickly, right? And like, I don't know, within say 6 weeks, they can kind of understand front end, back end, how to commit infrastructure as code. They get all of those things and you give them tickets they can work in them. That's maintainable code. Um, I think part of your question was also like, how do you know, how would you know if, let's say, you used a really bad third party service and like it was
Right.
really terrible? I think it's again pretty easy to ask, what percentage of your downtime or what percentage of bugs do you have that are relating to these things, right? Like, I mean, you'll know, right? If there's a lot of pain, you'll know. back in 2012 at a prior company, we used a recurring billing service, and we had at this point in time with third party services, we would do random testing where we would just hit their development endpoints randomly, and this service would return 500 errors about every fifth day out of their
Mhm.
dev service. And the lead developer was like, I don't feel comfortable using this service. And so we contacted them and they said, oh, it's totally normal for that to happen. And we were like, we totally disagree that like a 500 server should be a defect. And we were a really squeaky wheel about it. They had a couple of outages. We complained about those and we got fired as a customer. For bringing that up. Woke up one like September morning to get an email that was like, you have 30 days to get off our service because we don't you're an obnoxious twit. And I mean the joke was sort of on them because 6 months later, due to poor engineering, they lost all of their customers' data, and like their whole business was a recurring billing service that was supposed to store all the credit card information so you didn't have to be PCI compliant. And so,
Right.
who knows? I don't know what was causing the 500 server error. They had a poor database replication design where they replicated an error in the master. But I've always relied on that at this point. Like, right, like if you do regular testing and you understand the services you use, you can get a sense of which ones are good or not if you're actually using them. And
Yeah.
so, my past is like a history of services I will never use again because of bad experiences with them. But like, we discovered it.
Right. But I mean that's a risk too though, right? I mean, as soon as you use a third party service, a lot of that control is out of your hands, right? So how do you mitigate against that when you're integrating with third party services? Do you think about how, do you say how easily can we swap this out if we decide to go in a different direction?
Yeah, you do that, or you can like load test it and availability test it and see how long it's been in business and go look at. I mean, all of these services that are any good have status pages with lots of history, have customers who are references, and
Right.
so I don't think it's that hard to vet these to figure out if they would be okay. So I
Yeah.
don't know, like in the high risk category. I mean, I do think I'm a Fortune 500 company. I'm about to send like a million, transactions a month through this service that, just got out of Y Combinator last month and like, doesn't have a website. Like I wouldn't do that. But,
Right.
I think there are sort of standard vetting things you could do, and I think a lot of these services that, I would certainly recommend to anyone like Algolia or Cloudinary or Auth0. These services have been around for years and years and years. They're big.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Hey everyone, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, New Relic. Now, let's say you've got an incredibly complex architecture, which means monitoring takes a dozen different tools, and troubleshooting means jumping between data silos and dashboards. We all know this pain, and New Relic wants to change that. New Relic's designed everything you need in 3 products. Telemetry Data Platform holds all your data from any source. Full stack observability gives you one place to analyze, visualize, and troubleshoot your whole stack. And applied intelligence gives you automated detection and incident intelligence. Best of all, they're bucking the industry's love of complicated pricing to keep things simple and predictable. No more host-based pricing and no more constant upsell for more functionality. And you get 1 user and 100 gigabytes per month totally free. If you want observability made simple, check out New Relic at newrelic.com. So if you did have to swap out a service, right, or even not that, maybe you just say, look, we need to upgrade some piece of the system. Something's a little bit out of date. Maybe there's a new feature that's added. You want to go in and refactor, or maybe you just have something that's not running efficiently and you want to refactor. You've mentioned refactoring a number of times. Now, I know I've had a CEO in the past. I've had some interesting CEOs that I've worked for. One of them who still loved the idea of counting lines of code as if that was some sort of an asset and not a liability. And then I had another one who would say that if we leave engineers to their own devices and we don't give them specific projects, that they would just refactor all day. Is that, I mean, obviously you can't refactor all day, right? You need to build some new things every once in a while. But from your point of view, Like refactoring is a really important part of the software development cycle.
Absolutely. Look, I think this is a larger. There's a like a something that's higher level in this conversation, which is that if you have good technical leadership in your organization, your technical leaders will be able to. I mean, what they're trying to do is get enough trust from the rest of the organization so that you can do things the way you think is best. And so all of these things, like if you like any sentence that starts like if you left the engineers to themselves is just an example that there's no leader who's managing the trust in the
Right.
organization across the organization. And so I mean, like at Branch, we do not have a roadmap. We do not have deadlines. I mean, people can ask like, when do you think this thing is going to be done? But there's no like, there aren't company wide burn up and burn down charts. There aren't, we don't we do size things, but there aren't, there isn't this like, well, what day is everything that everyone's working on going to be done on? Like we don't do that. We don't do that because it takes time. And so would you rather have it done sooner, or would you rather have estimates that are wrong? And
Right.
that's the reality. Like that's the choice
Right.
that you're making. And so the only way that you get the rest of the organization to say like, okay, I'm not going to ask you for a roadmap. And like I've ran into this a lot at Branch because we've hired a lot of people who've worked at very large organizations at Branch. They're like, well, I want to see the roadmap. And I'm like, well, there is no roadmap. And they're like, what do you mean? You have to have a roadmap. We sit down and we talk and we say, well, if I had a roadmap, if you really needed something done, like it's going to go to the end of roadmap. I'm sure that's what you experienced, right? You asked for something, how
Yeah.
long did it take? Well, in my last company, it would take like 9 months to get it done. I'm like, okay, we'll get it done in like 2 or 3 weeks. But the trade-off for that is there's no roadmap, right?
Right.
Are you okay with the trade-off where you can get stuff done in 2 to 3 weeks instead of 9 months, but there's no roadmap? Like, do
Right.
you really want a roadmap more than you want like things done like 8 months earlier? And people are like, they're not sold on it. Like, I don't know. I don't like this is new. But if you can do this, if you can gain the trust by delivering software, I mean, this is why our agile is we come every week to deliver software. This is also like a lot of the accountability of developers, and a lot of what serverless gives you is developers have control about, we're going to deliver this stuff, right? We
Hmm.
don't have a DevOps team that blocks things. We don't have a DevSecOps team that blocks things. We don't have an operation team that blocks things, right? We build it. We have automated tests. We have some manual testing people who are asynchronous, and services that are asynchronous that will look at things occasionally. We have smoke tests, and we put things live, right? And everybody knows sometimes there will be bugs, right? Sometimes you can only catch these bugs in production. And we will fix them quickly, and we will ship things quickly for you. And so in that world, then, if you live in that world of trust like that, then you get to do what you want to do on the tech side. And so
Right.
and I can tell, I totally agree with you. Developers don't want to refactor all day, but developers also don't want, somebody breathing down their neck, trying to get trying to make them into a feature factory that they have no say in what's being done. And I mean, they're not allowed to clean up their room, basically, right? I mean, this is what
Right.
refactoring is. It's like, this is bad, and like we should either, some new features came out in React, let's say, that let us use them, or whatever they are. But this is the crazy thing about this is no different from like management in general, where you try to empower people to like have control over their space so that they can be more effective and happier, right? That's
Right.
all it is, really.
Yeah. And you mentioned three things that like all tie something together for me. One of those was tests, one of those was trust, and the other one was feature factory. And I had a consulting client. I went into this consulting client. They had maybe 10% code coverage. And the CEO and the sort of the COO did not trust the CTO because they had recently had a number of failures where they deployed something and the database broke. There was a database change in there that was in staging but didn't make it to production right. Standard stuff happens if you don't have a good process in place. So I go in and I'm looking at this test coverage, and I said to the CEO, I said, you need to give the development team time to add test coverage and add some additional tests in so that you can be confident when we launch a new update that we're not going to break something and then people are going to get mad. But The important thing is they wanted to pump out features. They had a ton of different clients that needed very specific things. It's like you quickly went from being a software company to being a custom web development company, it almost seemed like. But again, those things where not giving your team time to build the things they need to make sure that the process is solid, that's going to erode trust. Then when you don't have the trust, and then you keep pushing them to deliver feature after feature after feature without the time to go back and clean those up, without the time to ensure that everything is automated. That's a huge recipe for disaster. And honestly, I don't know many companies that I've consulted for or worked for that I haven't seen that type of vicious cycle over and over again.
Yeah, I agree. I think the vast majority of companies that do software development do it very badly. Another way to say this is I think the gap between the top, 1 to 5% of organizations in software development are like, dramatically. There's a chasm between them and the average.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as a co-founding CTO, or as a CTO, you've done this a number of different times. You mentioned things like no roadmaps, giving users or giving your developers time to refactor, things like no deadlines, no burn downs. A couple notes I have here. What else? Like, what else do you do? Like, if you're running a company, which you are, but if you're running that, if you're advising someone else to manage their developers and their development team, what are those things that we have to change? I think maybe as a culture, so that we can again build up that trust. Get to a point where you're delivering good software, but also not stressing people out. This idea of developers working 70, 80 hours a week, like, hey, that was great in my 20s. I did that in my 20s, in my early 30s. I don't want to have to do that anymore. I just want to be efficient. I want people to know that they can trust me to work on something and that I'll get it done. But like, what's that advice? Like, what does it need to look like? What does a modern development department need to look like, or modern engineering department?
I love this question, and I feel like this question isn't talked about enough.
Right.
And a huge problem with this question and the answers is that people want to find excuses for how they do things today. That's all they want to do. And they also nobody wants to make judgments in this space. They they just want to say what I do is, the way we do it is different and that would never work here. Now I will say, I've come in and consulted with many organizations, and my results consulting with them have ranged anywhere from like utter failure, where I failed to affect any useful change, to ones where I think I was impactful, but it took, years and years to have, really good effective change. So I don't think that it is easy at all to go in and make changes. And I certainly don't claim to be that good at it. I think the main thing that I would say to anyone, like as a starting point, is that we now have the best book ever written about this, which is Accelerate by Nicole Forgeron.
Great
And
book.
it lays out 4 metrics, and it gives you good ranges for those metrics. And I do think it is a fantastic way to manage organizations, if there are good metrics, to manage them to metrics, right? I mean, I've like marketing organizations, sales organizations, finance organizations, like managing them to metrics works, and they're happy to do it. And I believe that the 4 metrics in Accelerate are 4 really excellent metrics. And I think they're a great way to align. Like, if you could so the last few times I've been asked this, I've said, to the CEO, like, you get on board with these metrics, let's get the CTO on board with these metrics, and let's optimize to the metrics. And then that will at least that empowers the technical teams to figure out how they're going to get there. And those metrics are, you need to be releasing multiple times a week, right? You need to resolve errors quickly. You need to have a low rate of failure. And low rate is just like less than 50%, right? So they give you these metrics. I do actually think the most important one is deploying multiple times a week.
Right.
I think that if you're not deploying multiple times a week, you should be. And I also think that, you should be trying to get to a point where Friday deploys don't scare you, or at least let me put it this way. You should be deploying frequently enough so that, and have good enough testing so that, you know, most of your bug reports are not in the thing you just deployed, right? I
Right.
mean, in my experience at Branch, most of the bugs we find are bugs that have been in the code for a couple releases before they're found, right?
Right.
Even regressions. And so because of that, like, you don't need to fear the Friday deploy because like it's already in the code, like the next bug you're finding is already there.
Right.
And also you're deploying such a small thing that like it's not that big of a deal. I'm totally sympathetic to like maybe you shouldn't deploy something, right before you like go to sleep or something. Like
Mhm.
I mean, like I'm not opposed to that. And we don't do automated deploys at Branch. We deploy several times a week. But I think we've deployed like 2 or 3 times today, for example.
Right.
And I mean, totally fine. So anyway, that's where I would start from. That book is fantastic. Everyone should read it. And it's really important if you're trying to make an organization run better.
Right. And so at Branch, so part of your development process, I think it's really interesting because again, you try not to overwhelm your engineers, right? There's no working nights and weekends. That's not. I mean, I'm sure if maybe there's something critical, then maybe that would happen. But what about using like ticketing systems? Like, how do you use ticketing systems at Branch?
Yeah, so I mean, I really don't like Jira. I mean, I've used Jira a lot in my past. There's a really good article by John Evans. I think he's at Resendi, that he wrote in TechCrunch, where he wrote about how Jira is terrible. And when I first read it, I was like, he's totally wrong. And then like over time, I've come to think that it's one of the better articles on it. And so we use GitHub and GitHub projects and issues. And this is a classic case of where we started using it in a certain way and it didn't work that well. And we used retro and so there was a lot of like, well, maybe we should use Jira. And I was like, okay, just prove to me that this won't work, right? Like
Yeah.
I am down with using, and we got into the linear beta and stuff like that. But I was like, I really
Yeah.
don't want to use Jira, but like I will use Jira if you guys say to use Jira. I just like make it like force it. And so I actually hired a PM who had never been a PM before because I didn't want to bring. I generally have this thing. I don't like senior developers or senior PMs because in general I find that all they're going to do is like bring whatever process they had instead of like
Right.
looking at what's great about what we do. I mean, I know this isn't it's not all of this, not all senior people everywhere, but like I think that I mean I've experienced that in my career. Senior people don't look at what you're using; they just are like, okay, we're going to change over to like however I did it the last
Right. Right.
time. And so there's this, and so I brought in a PM who'd never been a PM, and I was like, look, like you're gonna use retro, and we're gonna use retro to figure out what we don't like about what we're doing, and we're gonna try to fix it, and we're gonna try to use GitHub and GitHub projects and issues, and if it doesn't work, like we'll know why. We'll know the
Right.
limitations. And so we're in like iteration, like, I don't know, 6. And like it works really well. Like we have a super functional way of using GitHub projects and issues to like do everything we need to do, look at statuses, everything.
Right. And so you mentioned that you don't do sprints, right? And burn down charts and some of those other things. So when somebody gets a ticket, so how does that work? Do you assign someone a ticket? Do they get a ticket themselves? Like how do they take multiple tickets? Are they like dumped in a batch on them and say, get these done by the end of the week? Or again, you said no
Yeah.
deadlines, but how does that work?
Yeah. So and one thing that I'll add is that I don't like the thing that I don't like about Accelerate is that it doesn't it is only concerned with work being done. When the work is done, the development work is done, how does that get live and stable? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's Accelerate.
It's a
There's an
good point. Yep.
entire other book to be written on there is a business problem that needs to be solved with custom software development or something by the team that does software development. How do you get to the code is done, right? That work
Right.
is done. And so it's useful to talk about, the process that we use for this is we really require the business to state problems, not solutions. You can give solutions as examples. And again, this is an example of like we have trust, so we get to
Mm-hmm.
define the process. When the trust breaks down, we lose control over the process. But our process is you help us understand the problem you're trying to solve and potential solutions to it, maybe if you want to give them. That goes to our designers. And our
Yeah.
designers are going to come back, and multiple times a week, there's a designer review meeting, and you're going to get to go look at the designs, and you can approve them or not. Okay? You don't get to bring designs. Like as a business stakeholder, you can't go say, I need a button here and it's this color and it needs to say this. You don't get to say that, right? You can say, I want to solve this problem. And one way to solve the problem might be to put a button here in this color or whatever. But eventually you learn like, it's not even worth telling them that because they're going to design what they want to design. So I'm just going to tell you what. So I'm going to get really good, which is what you want the business stakeholders to do, right? You want them to get really good at helping you explain what problem they're trying to solve, right?
Right.
And then the designers deliver designs. Okay, once a design is accepted, could be the first design, could be the 85th design, right? So the process is the designers get to propose whatever, but the business stakeholders accept the designs. And so either they accept them or they don't. And so you can, and sometimes it gets a little tense. It's okay. It works, as long as you learn how to disagree with people, which is a skill everyone needs to have, right? And work through disagreements, right? So once the design is set, our designers design in Sketch and they use InVision for interactions and they export to Zeppelin. Zeppelin's amazing because it gives you all of the sort of margins and fonts and things, so you don't have to eyeball something and try to figure out what the CSS should be. So, but when a developer gets a task, that ticket has the designs, and so they get just work the designs, and they've probably been and actually before they get it, there are weekly, basically like sprint planning meetings, except there's no sprints, right? So every week we try to go size and talk about all of the tickets that might be worked by someone before the next weekly meeting in which we will do the same thing again. So that's all. It's like, it's not that, this is like, right, we've got a method that's working. It's sort of Kanban-y. But we steal the ceremonies we need. But this is like Agile, right? We're just trying to figure out like what's the best way to get what we want. And then what's great about retro is that we bring up like, retro concerns are things like maybe like when in demo, sometimes the business stakeholders seem like they're shocked by what they got, like what happened. Like it seems like they should have been like they accepted that design, right?
Yeah.
Or like you'll get those. And so then that prompts somebody to think about, how could I revise this process? How could I clean this up? Was that a one-off, right? But I like that, like those are the types of things that we have in retro, as opposed to retro being I think when we started retro and when GitHub projects wasn't fully working, it was a lot like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be working on. I did this thing, but like I did it and like totally wasn't set. So like, and people were like, that's not what we want at all. Like, so I don't like, as a developer, you do a lot of work, you throw it away. And so like, we don't actually do that. Like I would say today, most of the work that's done, it's right. It goes out the door. It's small in scope. We watch it and then it iterates on it.
Hi everyone, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor Epsagon. Epsagon enables teams to instantly simplify, visualize, and understand what's happening within their complex microservice architectures. With their comprehensive, lightweight auto-instrumentation, users are able to eliminate the gaps in data and manual work associated with other APM solutions, providing significant reductions in issue detection, troubleshooting, and resolution times. Epsagon aggregates, unifies, analyzes, and correlates data from all the third-party tools you love, delivering a single pane of glass for understanding serverless, containers, Kubernetes, and more. Engineers now know when something is wrong and can immediately trace issues to root cause before they affect production. Increase development efficiency and reduce application downtime with Epsagon. As a special for Serverless Chats listeners, if you try out Epsagon and connect your first trace today, they'll hook you up with one of their awesome t-shirts. Check it out at epsagon.com/serverlesschats. That's what I was going to ask you about in terms of scoping. So, one of the biggest problems I've seen when you use a ticketing system is someone will say something, there'll be a job and they'll say, move this button 5 pixels to the right or rename this button, like something simple, like small scope. And then the other one will be like, build a new, billing system, so like very, very large scope project. So what's your process in terms of sort of down scoping things to get to the right level of work so you don't have an engineer stuck in a back room for 3 months?
Yeah. Yeah, so there are a bunch of tactics here. One of them is in when you have trust, you can convince your stakeholders to downscope themselves. And so at Branch, we have a saying. We actually have our branch roots, which are like the sort of principles, cultural principles that we have. So and we say a lot. And so one of them is, what's the V1? And so this is like endemic language throughout Branch, but essentially somebody comes in and we ask like, well, is this enough for the V1? And everyone's on board with this because they understand that one, it'll get out faster, and two, when they want to make changes to, like, we all recognize you're going to want to make changes to it.
Right.
And so this is the delightful thing about everyone bought into what's the V1. So if you can get that, that helps downscope. Of course, sometimes the V1 is large, right? So I think it's very important. And so one of the rules that we have is that you need to, anything large, you got to build a release schedule, and you got to release at least every 2 weeks, preferably every week. And so we'll have a branch. So we will have branches that live for 2 weeks, let's say. Now we run a monorepo, and we use GitTown, which is like an open source like thing that makes it easy to, I mean, it's like any of those like GitFlow, whatever, but it allows you to merge trunk to branch, very easily.
Yeah.
And so, we tend not, I mean, we have obviously we have to resolve some merge conflicts, but we do our best to make sure that, we have a couple different teams. So we do our best to make sure that like there aren't multiple teams working on the same code at the same time, right? And then we have people collaborating, and you do some sort of planning so you don't collide into everybody. But we use feature flags to release things so that they're out there but not live. And so I think there are a bunch of tactics there. But in general, that's the strategy. I think another thing that we usually do is if you are working on something that's going to be like a week or two, that you put at least 2 developers on it, and they'll split up the work or whatever. But it tends to be that tends to be very good in a lot of different ways, to have that extra number of people, to have somebody gets sick. And then also to have like a focus, like we care a lot about this, it's big, and so like we're devoting a lot of time to it.
Right. And it sounds like that provides a lot of transparency, where everyone can kind of look. So those business stakeholders and they can go in and they can say, this project is 50% done, or it's in someone's queue or whatever. How do you push back against business stakeholders though, or the stakeholders when they do push something like, oh, we really need this feature, I really need you to prioritize that? Is that something where, again, I know the trust is a big piece there, but as the CTO, or as I don't know if you have engineering managers, but is that something that you really push back on the business side of things?
No, I mean, this is the benefit of not having a roadmap. So like, yeah, if you're like, I really need this, then sometimes there's a conversation with the other business stakeholders, right? I always find that like complete like transparency solves so many of these problems, right? Like, and I've worked with so many CTOs who like to hide information. I was consulting for the CTO, who's like, I really don't like to let my vendors know everything that's going on. And I was like, you're an idiot. Like, tell everybody everything. And then like, and if they're bad people, don't work with them. But like, it's crazy to hide information. So no, like if someone's like, I really need this, then I go make sure that the other stakeholders are okay with us moving that ahead. I mean, one rule we tend to have is I won't interrupt a developer working on anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the best I'm ever going to do for you is put it up next, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to go up next for the appropriate developer or developers, which could be lots of them, or in some cases it might be like there's one person who should do this.
Yeah.
And so you're just going to have to wait till they're ready. And I think very occasionally, like for each developer, maybe once every 6 months or something, we might interrupt them, right? We might say, hey, can you just put down what you're working on? And we really got to fix this thing. Usually it would be a bug, right?
Right.
But that's very infrequent. And so everybody gets that. But, in general, everyone's primed. I got to tell you, if you're a business stakeholder and you know that something you really care about can be done in about a week, if it needs designs, maybe 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you've worked anywhere else at any other organization, you're like, I'll take that.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what other weird processes you have, but like that's fast,
Right. Yeah. No, and I think that is, I don't know. I think that's just amazing, that idea of of having business stakeholders that understand what the processes are within the engineering organization, and having that leadership. I think that's the most important thing, having the leadership within that engineering organization to really go to bat for your engineers, build up that trust, have that history of delivering things. That's of course, I think it's a fantasy world in a lot of organizations, right? I think they can get there, but I think the vast majority of organizations aren't quite at that level yet.
Yeah, I mean, the one organization that I really helped go from like no ticketing system, all tickets on whiteboards, um, terrible communication, business stakeholders like walking into the developers, you know, offices and like sitting over their shoulder while they worked on stuff. I mean, that it was no testing,
Right.
1.5 million lines of PHP in the application. One page took like 7 minutes to load on average, stuff like that in a SaaS product lots of people were using. I mean, it was not in a good place. And like, they're now like 3 years later. And I mean, we brought in a consulting firm that was really good, that really collaborates with you. But everybody there was like, I want help, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge, I mean, I know that the biggest challenge to fixing and making an engineering organization go from, like, let's say not compliant with the accelerate metrics to compliant is most of the people in that organization saying, I want help and I know it's not good.
Yeah.
I'm willing to listen to people who aren't me, you know?
Right.
And like, until you get to that point, obviously you're not going to change anything.
Yeah.
But and I mean, there's so much around trust here that matters. I mean, it really helps to be the technical co-founder. It really helps to be one of the first two people in the company on day one, and so you predate everybody else. Like that helps a
Right.
lot, right? But it also, I mean, that doesn't mean, like, I've held lots of meetings in which I have explained, like, this is how we do things. What questions do you have? And people going, I don't get why you do this. Like, why can't I do this thing? Right. And I
Mm-hmm.
and explaining, like, well, you're right. Like, if you look at it from that perspective, it seems bad. But here's why.
Yeah.
Like one of the concerns that I get a lot is because you won't let me specify designs, I'm reliant on those designers to come back and they get to make whatever designs they want. And so, like, I mean, like, I could be waiting forever for something. And I was like, but have you? Like, does
Yeah.
this happen in practice? Yes, you're right. Like, it's a theoretical concern. But I've probably spent, over the past 2 or 3 years, I've probably spent like 15 to 20 hours. So not a ton, but in meetings, just asking people to vent about what they
Yeah.
didn't like about it and just explaining why we did what we did, or why we do what
Yeah.
we do.
Well, that's why I like junior devs, because you can just bend them to your will usually and say, no, this is how.
It's it's awesome. It's so awesome to take someone who's like not had a lot of experience and they come in and they're like, wow, everyone's kind of happy here. We
Yeah.
only work
Right.
like 40 hours a week. No deadlines. I get to kind of just work. I'm not in a lot of meetings every week. Okay, I'll do it however the hell you tell me to do it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. All right. Awesome. So I just want to ask you one more question, because this is something I'm always interested to see. And again, because you use so many third-party services, and you've been fully serverless, like you said, for a couple of companies now, where is serverless going? I know it's kind of a cliche question, but 5 years from now, right? Is serverless just going to be part of the cloud? I mean, are we just going to not even think about it? Is there going to be a distinction between what we consider serverless and what we don't? I mean, all of these major cloud providers are creating these Kubernetes management systems where you're not even going to manage Kubernetes anymore. So it's just going to be Kubernetes, but you're not technically going to be managing Kubernetes. You're just going to be using Knative on top of it or whatever it is. So it's like going to go away. It's going to abstract away. Like, are we getting close to that anyways, where just these public cloud providers are going to take over the management and serverless is just going to be the way forward?
I mean, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think one, never underestimate engineers' desire to keep doing the things the way they have been doing them or to make iterative improvements. So like if you were managing VMs with Terraform and your job was to manage VMs with Terraform, I mean, this is the problem. Right? I talked about the Oracle DBA. and I think Simon Wardley talks about this a bit, but like we now have a whole, like the new Oracle DBA is probably
Right.
DevOps, right? So you just built up a big DevOps team. Well, I don't think you're leaving containers or VMs until that team is
Right.
gone. And I don't, and your prod infrastructure runs on those. So you're in like a bad place, you know? I mean, you could, like, you hired me as like a CTO in an organization, you dropped me in and all your prod was running on Kubernetes, and there are like, 3 people who understand how it's set up, and like it's kind of brittle in places, like that's a tough place to be in. Like you're going to be there for many
Yeah.
years. And a lot of people are like jumping into that right now.
Yeah.
So, I don't, and I think VMware is out there and has a lot of incentive to drive that, and is a very competent organization that will continue to proliferate that. I also think there's like a huge debate about what is serverless and what are good serverless
Right.
architectures. And when I go out and talk about serverless, there are a lot of senior devs in the Hacker News world who are like, well, you just stitch a bunch of APIs together, and I don't want to do that.
Right.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, I live in a world where all at Branch we only hire front end developers. Like I went out to try to find to try to see could I find a senior developer I wanted, and I advertised for a software development leader, and like 100% of the resumes and I said, you need to have a year framework, develop a year experience, not necessarily in your job, but just a year experience developing in a modern JavaScript framework, and like no applications
Yeah.
that I got had that. And I was like, okay, all the front end developers are selecting out, right? And all of the back end developers are, selecting in, and then they're not qualified.
Right.
And so, I really believe in this full stack front end developer. I really believe in stitching these APIs together. And I believe very strongly in all of those things, but I don't think that there's a lot of acceptance on that at all. But you asked me about the future. I think the future is a service that is like DraftBit. So draft, and I think this is like, I don't really believe in no code
Mm-hmm.
as for interfaces, because I think in the end you're gonna want to customize the
Right.
interface. Okay, like that is the one thing everyone is going to want to do, and that is a place which is going to pay off in every organization, to customize the interface to your specifics. And the idea you can do that through drag and drop, I haven't seen
Yeah.
it. But DraftBit is this interesting product that lets you almost like drag and drop build a React Native app, but it compiles to React Native. So you can eject it to React
Mm-hmm.
Native. So you can build it there. And when you reach a point where you're like, I got to customize this more, learn React
Yeah.
Native. And then you keep going. And so so another way to say this is, if you look at the future is just better higher level abstractions that compile down to lower level functional code that you can work with.
Yeah.
And so, because if you build the version that you can't compile down to code, but is like totally proprietary, right? Which is kind of like the Airtables of the
Right.
world, right? What you have is fundamentally proprietary. Until you give me the ability to like do extensive modification in code, I'm gonna have to leave you, right? I'm gonna outgrow you, right? Or you're gonna be an internal tool, right? But I think this is the future. I think AppSync, built on what Firebase did, it's a great high level abstraction, but you have full access to customize everything you'd care to customize
Right.
about it. EventBridge, another version of this that's like fantastic. So we have this great history of these things. We're seeing them on the front end more and more. And so that's what I think the future of highly effective development is. But I think the challenge is that 80+% of organizations are going to have a bunch of people working for them who are going to resist this tooth and nail, because it means they will have to throw out what they have invested so much in to
Right.
date.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. That's amazing. Well, listen, Joe, thank you so much for chatting with me and sharing your immense knowledge, and not just serverless, but also just managing an organization. Honestly, if there's any, I guess, technical leader out there right now, read Accelerate, listen to the advice Joe just gave, push back on your CEO. It's not about lines of code. It's not about a feature factory. It's about having a healthy, productive, trusting, transparent organization where everyone's working together to, just like you said, make themselves better. So if people want to contact you, how do they do that?
Twitter, at Joe Emison.
All right. And then you have a blog too, emison.org, right?
Yep.
And then branch insurance is just ourbranch.com.
That's right.
Awesome. All right. Well, I will get all that in the show notes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. I want to give a huge thank you to Joe Emison for being my guest this week, and to our sponsors New Relic and Epsagon. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/73. For more Serverless Chats, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with me on Twitter at Jeremy_Daily, and if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.